The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, California, casting a warm golden glow over the rows of neatly trimmed lawns and identical two-story houses. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where kids rode their bikes down the cul-de-sac, and where the most exciting event of the week was the Saturday farmers market. But beneath the surface of this idyllic community, tensions simmered, and no one embodied those tensions more than Karen Miller. Karen was the kind of neighbor who could turn a simple hello into a full-blown argument. She was in her late 50s, with a perpetually pinched expression and a voice that could cut through steel. She had a reputation for being overly territorial, whether it was about her meticulously manicured lawn or the parking space in front of her house. If a leaf from your tree drifted into her yard, you'd hear about it. If your dog barked for more than 5 minutes, she'd be on your doorstep with a complaint. Karen was, in short, the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer of rules that only she seemed to know. I had moved into the neighborhood about a year ago, drawn by the quiet streets and the promise of a fresh start. My house was a modest one, nestled between Karen's pristine white colonial and the Rodriguez family's cheerful yellow bungalow. I kept to myself for the most part, waving hello to my neighbors when I saw them and occasionally joining the block parties that happened a few times a year. But Karen had taken an immediate dislike to me, and I could never quite figure out why. Maybe it was because I parked my car in front of her house once when I had guests over. Maybe it was because I didn't mow my lawn as often as she thought I should. Or maybe it was just because I didn't bow to her every demand. Whatever the reason, Karen had made it her mission to make my life as difficult as possible. It started with small things. She'd leave passive-aggressive notes on my windshield, reminding me that this is a family neighborhood and that I should be more considerate. She'd glare at me from her porch when I took out the trash, as if I were committing some grave offense by existing. And then there were the complaints. Oh, the complaints. She called the homeowners association on me for having a messy yard. I had left a rake out overnight. She reported my dog for barking. He had been barking at a squirrel. She even accused me of stealing her newspaper, which I hadn't even known she subscribed to. I tried to brush it off at first. After all, Karen was just one person, and I had bigger things to worry about. But as the months went by, her behavior became more and more erratic. She started pacing her yard at odd hours, muttering to herself. She installed motion-activated lights that shone directly into my bedroom window. And then one day she crossed a line. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was heading out to work when I noticed something strange on my driveway. At first, I thought it was a piece of trash that had blown in overnight. But as I got closer, I realized it was a strip of metal with sharp, pointed spikes. It was a spike strip, the kind used to puncture tires. My heart sank as I looked around, half expecting to see Karen watching me from her window. But the street was quiet, and her house was dark. I crouched down to inspect the strip. It was clearly homemade, with jagged edges and uneven spacing between the spikes. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make this, and I had a pretty good idea who that someone was. I carefully picked up the strip with a pair of gloves and set it aside, my mind racing. What was Karen trying to do? Was this some kind of warning? Or was she just trying to scare me? I decided not to confront her right away. Instead, I called the local hardware store and asked if anyone had recently purchased materials that could be used to make a spike strip. The clerk hesitated for a moment before admitting that a woman matching Karen's description had come in a few days ago, buying metal strips and screws. She said it was for a DIY project. The clerk added, sounding uneasy. That was all the confirmation I needed. Karen had made the spike strip, and she had placed it on my driveway. But why? What was she trying to accomplish? I knew I couldn't let this slide, but I also knew that confronting her directly would only escalate the situation. So I did the only thing I could think of. I installed a security camera. The camera was small and discreet, mounted just above my front door. It had night vision and motion detection, and it would record everything that happened on my property. If Karen tried anything else, I'd have proof. And if she didn't, well, at least I'd have some peace of mind. For the next few days, nothing happened. Karen stayed inside her house, and the neighborhood was as quiet as ever. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go down. Karen wasn't the type to let things go, and I knew she was just biding her time. Then, one night, the camera caught something. It was around 2 a.m., and I was fast asleep when my phone buzzed with a notification. I groggily picked it up and opened the app, my heart skipping a beat as I saw the footage. There, in the grainy black and white video, was Karen. She was crouched on my driveway, wearing a dark hoodie and gloves, and she was holding something in her hands. It was another spike strip. I watched in disbelief as she carefully placed the strip on the ground, right where my car tires would be in the morning. She looked around nervously, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight, and then she hurried back to her house. The whole thing took less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. I sat there in the dark, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? Call the police? Confront her? I knew I had to act, but I also knew that Karen was unpredictable. If I pushed her too far, there was no telling what she might do. As I sat there, staring at the footage on my phone, I realized that this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't going to stop, not unless I did something to stop her. And whatever happened next, I knew it was going to change everything. The morning after I caught Karen on camera, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. The footage was still fresh in my mind. Her hunched figure, the glint of the spike strip in the dim light, the way she had glanced over her shoulder like a criminal in a bad movie. I replayed it in my head as I sipped my coffee, trying to figure out my next move. I knew I couldn't let this slide, but I also knew that confronting Karen directly would only make things worse. She was volatile, and I didn't want to give her any more ammunition against me. I decided to start by gathering more evidence. I downloaded the footage from the camera and saved it to my computer, making sure to back it up in multiple places. Then I went outside to inspect the spike strip she had left on my driveway. It was still there, lying in the same spot where she had placed it. I crouched down to take a closer look, careful not to touch it. The spikes were sharp and uneven, clearly homemade. It was a miracle I hadn't driven over it in the dark. I took a few photos of the strip from different angles, making sure to capture the details. Then I carefully picked it up with a pair of gloves and placed it in a plastic bag. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew it could be important later. As I stood there, holding the bagged spike strip, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned to see Karen standing on her porch, watching me. She was wearing a floral housecoat and sipping from a mug, her expression unreadable. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension between us palpable. Then she raised her mug in a mock toast and went back inside. I felt a surge of anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. Karen was trying to provoke me, and I couldn't let her win. I went back inside and sat down at my computer, pulling up the footage from the camera again. I needed to figure out what to do next. After some thought, I decided to reach out to a few of my neighbors. I didn't want to involve the whole neighborhood in my drama with Karen, but I needed to know if anyone else had experienced her wrath. I started with the Rodriguez family next door. Maria Rodriguez was a kind, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, and her husband, Carlos, was a retired police officer. If anyone would understand what I was going through, it was them. I knocked on their door that evening, and Maria answered with a warm smile. "Hey, neighbor, what's up?" I hesitated for a moment, then decided to just come out with it. "I need to talk to you about Karen." Maria's smile faded, and she stepped aside to let me in. "Come on in. Carlos is in the living room." I followed her inside, where Carlos was watching a baseball game on TV. He muted the TV when he saw me and gestured for me to sit down. "What's going on?" I explained everything: the spike strips, the camera footage, Karen's increasingly erratic behavior. Maria and Carlos listened intently, their expressions growing more serious as I spoke. "That woman is a menace," Maria said when I finished. "She's been causing trouble for years, but no one's ever done anything about it. She called the cops on us once because our dog was barking," Carlos added. "But when they showed up, they saw she was the one causing the disturbance. She was screaming at us from her porch." "Why hasn't anyone reported her?" I asked. Carlos shrugged. "Most people just try to avoid her. She's like a ticking time bomb. You never know what's going to set her off." I told them about the footage I had and the spike strip I had bagged. I'm thinking about going to the police, but I'm not sure if they'll take me seriously. Carlos leaned forward, his expression serious. You need to report her. What she's doing is dangerous. If you don't stop her now, she's just going to keep escalating. Maria nodded in agreement. And if you need backup, we've got your back. Their support gave me the confidence I needed. The next morning, I went to the local police station and filed a report. I showed them the footage and the spike strip, and they took it all very seriously. They promised to look into it and told me to call them immediately if Karen did anything else. I left the station feeling relieved but still on edge. I knew Karen wasn't going to take this lying down. If she found out I had gone to the police, she would only get worse. Sure enough, that evening, I heard a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw Karen standing there, her arms crossed and her face set in a scowl. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Can I help you, Karen? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She glared at me, her eyes blazing with anger. I know what you did, she spat. You went to the police. How dare you? I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated. You left a spike strip on my driveway, Karen. That's dangerous and illegal. I had no choice. She took a step closer, her voice rising. You think you're so clever, don't you? Well, you're not going to get away with this. I'll make your life a living hell. I could feel my heart pounding, but I kept my voice steady. If you threaten me again, I'll call the police right now. For a moment, she just stared at me, her chest heaving with rage. Then she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. I closed my door and leaned against it, my legs trembling. I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't going to stop, not unless I did something to stop her. And whatever happened next, I knew it was going to be even worse than what had come before. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the confrontation in my head, wondering if I had done the right thing. I knew I had to stand up to Karen, but I also knew that she was capable of anything. I just hoped I was ready for whatever came next. The days following my confrontation with Karen were tense. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting her to appear out of nowhere with another spike strip or some new form of harassment. The security camera became my lifeline, its blinking red light a reassuring sign that I was being watched over. Not by Karen, but by technology that would capture her every move. I checked the footage religiously, scanning for any sign of her. But for a while, it seemed like Karen had gone quiet. Too quiet. I wasn't naive enough to believe she had given up. Karen wasn't the type to back down. If anything, her silence was more unnerving than her outbursts. It felt like the calm before the storm, and I was bracing myself for whatever she had planned next. Then, one night, the storm hit. It was around 2 a.m. when my phone buzzed with a notification from the security camera app. I jolted awake, my heart racing as I fumbled for my phone. The notification read, "Motion detected at front door." I opened the app and saw the live feed. There she was, Karen, dressed in all black, crouched on my driveway. She was holding something in her hands, but it wasn't a spike strip this time. It was a can of spray paint. I watched in disbelief as she began spraying something on my garage door. The camera's night vision made everything look grainy, but I could still make out the words she was writing. Mind your own business. My hands trembled as I recorded the screen with my phone, making sure to capture every second of her vandalism. This was it, the evidence I needed to finally put an end to her madness. But then, something unexpected happened. As Karen finished her work and stepped back to admire it, a loud click echoed through the quiet night. She froze, her head snapping toward the sound. The motion-activated floodlight on her own house had turned on, illuminating her like a deer in headlights. For a moment, she just stood there, stunned. Then, from inside her house, an alarm started blaring. Karen's face went pale. She dropped the spray paint can and bolted toward her house, but it was too late. The alarm was deafening, and within minutes, the entire neighborhood was awake. Lights flicked on in houses up and down the street, and I could hear voices murmuring in confusion. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and called the police. "There's someone vandalizing my property," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have it all on camera. Please send someone right away." The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way. I hung up and watched through the camera as Karen frantically tried to silence her alarm. She was fumbling with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the door open. When she finally managed to get inside, the alarm stopped, but the damage was already done. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up to my house. 2 officers stepped out, their flashlights sweeping over my driveway and garage door. I met them outside, holding my phone with the footage ready to show them. "She's been harassing me for months," I explained, handing over my phone. "This is just the latest incident. I have video evidence of everything." The officers watched the footage, their expressions growing more serious by the second. "Do you know where she is now?" one of them asked. I nodded toward Karen's house. "She ran inside when her alarm went off. She lives right there." The officers exchanged a look and headed toward Karen's house. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. Karen was finally going to face the consequences of her actions. The officers knocked on Karen's door, but there was no answer. They knocked again, louder this time. "Ms. Miller, this is the police. Open the door." Still nothing. One of the officers tried the handle, and to everyone's surprise, the door was unlocked. They stepped inside, calling out to Karen as they went. I stayed on the porch, unsure if I should follow. But then I heard one of the officers say something that made my blood run cold. "Ma'am, step away from the weapons." Weapons? My mind raced. What was going on? I peered through the open door and saw Karen standing in her living room, her face pale and her hands raised. But that wasn't what caught my attention. What caught my attention was the wall behind her. A wall lined with guns. Rifles, handguns, even what looked like a shotgun. They were neatly displayed like trophies in a museum. The officers were clearly on high alert. One of them kept his hand on his holster while the other approached Karen cautiously. "Do you have a permit for these firearms?" he asked. Karen didn't answer. She just stood there, her eyes darting around like a cornered animal. The officer turned to his partner. "Call it in. We're going to need backup." Within minutes, more police cars arrived, their lights flashing in the quiet neighborhood. Officers swarmed Karen's house, securing the scene and questioning her. I stood on the sidewalk, watching in stunned silence as the situation unfolded. This wasn't just about vandalism anymore. This was something much bigger. One of the officers approached me, his expression grim. "We're going to need to take your statement," he said. "But I think it's safe to say you're not the only one who's had problems with her." I nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. "What's going to happen to her?" I asked. The officer sighed. "That depends. If those weapons are illegal, she could be facing some serious charges. But for now, we're going to take her in for questioning." As I watched Karen being led out of her house in handcuffs, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, disbelief, even a little pity. She had brought this on herself, but it was still shocking to see her fall so hard and so fast. The officers took my statement and assured me they would be in touch. As they drove away, I stood on my driveway, staring at the words Karen had spray painted on my garage door. "Mind your own business." I couldn't help but laugh. If only she had taken her own advice. But as I went back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Karen was in custody, but I had a feeling her story was far from finished. And whatever came next, I knew it was going to be even more shocking than what had already happened. The days following Karen's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. News of her detainment spread quickly through the neighborhood, and soon it seemed like everyone had an opinion about what had happened. Some people were shocked, others unsurprised, and a few even expressed sympathy for her. But for me, the most important thing was that I finally felt safe in my own home. Karen was no longer a looming threat, and the spike strips and spray paint were gone, replaced by a fresh coat of paint on my garage door. The police kept me updated on the investigation. It turned out that Karen's collection of firearms was not only extensive but also largely unregistered. She had no permits for most of the weapons, and some of them were illegal to own under California law. On top of that, They found evidence linking her to a series of anonymous complaints filed against neighbors over the years, complaints that had caused unnecessary stress and even legal trouble for some families. It seemed Karen had been waging a one-woman war against the entire neighborhood, and I had just been her latest target. As the investigation deepened, more shocking details came to light. Karen had a history of erratic behavior that stretched back years, but it had always been dismissed as harmless eccentricity. No one had ever thought to dig deeper, to question why she was so obsessed with control and order. But now, with the evidence piling up, it was clear that Karen's actions were more than just petty grievances. They were the result of something darker, something that had been festering beneath the surface for a long time. A week after her arrest, I received a call from Detective Martinez, the lead investigator on the case. "We've uncovered something you need to know," he said, his tone serious. "Can you come down to the station?" I agreed, my stomach churning with anxiety. What else could there be? I had already seen enough to last a lifetime. When I arrived at the station, Detective Martinez led me to a small interview room. He handed me a folder and gestured for me to sit down. "Take a look at this," he said. I opened the folder and began to read. Inside were documents detailing Karen's past. A past she had kept hidden from everyone. It turned out that Karen had been involved in a series of incidents in her previous neighborhood. Incidents that had resulted in restraining orders and even a brief stint in a psychiatric facility. She had moved to Willow Creek shortly after being released, and no one had known about her history. "We also found this," Detective Martinez said, sliding a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Karen, much younger, standing next to a man in military fatigues. "That's her ex-husband. He was discharged from the army for erratic behavior and was later arrested for domestic violence. Karen was his primary victim." I stared at the photo, my mind reeling. It was hard to reconcile the woman in the picture, smiling, carefree, with the Karen I knew, but it also explained so much. Her need for control, her paranoia, her obsession with rules and order. It was all a reaction to the chaos she had endured. "What's going to happen to her now?" I asked. Detective Martinez sighed. "She's been charged with multiple counts of illegal possession of firearms, vandalism, and harassment. Given her history, it's likely she'll be ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluation and treatment. But she's also facing significant jail time." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also sadness. Karen was a troubled woman, and while her actions were inexcusable, it was hard not to feel a little sorry for her. She had been a victim long before she became a perpetrator. As I left the station, I couldn't help but think about how different things could have been if someone had intervened earlier. If Karen had gotten the help she needed, maybe none of this would have happened. But it was too late for what-ifs. All I could do now was move forward. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, but the events of the past few weeks left a lasting impact. People were more cautious, more aware of the potential for hidden dangers. But they were also more united. The block parties became more frequent, and neighbors who had barely spoken before were now checking in on each other regularly. It was as if Karen's actions had reminded us all of the importance of community. As for me, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The constant tension that had defined my life for months was gone, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I even started to enjoy little things I had taken for granted, like parking my car in front of my house without worrying about spike strips or walking my dog without glancing over my shoulder. But the most surprising thing was how I felt about Karen. I didn't hate her. I didn't even resent her. Instead, I felt a strange sense of pity. She was a broken woman, and while that didn't excuse her actions, it did help me understand them. In a way, I hoped she would get the help she needed, even if it was behind bars. A few months later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Karen. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in her neat, precise handwriting. "Dear neighbor, I know you probably never want to hear from me again, and I don't blame you. I've done terrible things and I can't take them back. But I wanted to say I'm sorry, not just for what I did to you, but for everything. I've been angry for so long, and I didn't know how to stop. I'm getting help now, and for the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe. I hope one day you can forgive me, Karen. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it away. I didn't know if I could forgive her, but I appreciated the gesture. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. As I looked out at the quiet street, I felt a sense of closure. The nightmare was over, and life was finally returning to normal. But I knew I would never forget what had happened. Not just because of the shock and fear, but because of the lessons I had learned. About the importance of standing up for yourself, about the power of community, and about the hidden struggles that can lie beneath even the most ordinary facades. And as I sat there, watching the sun set over Willow Creek, I realized that sometimes the most shocking stories are the ones that teach us the most.